The sky over the Korvat spur was a sheet of hammered gray steel, indifferent and absolute. Below it, the world was all jagged teeth and bruised shadows, a landscape of fractured rock and pine forests, clinging desperately to life. Major Katerina Nix Volkov felt the terrain in her bones, a low, resonant vibration that traveled up the stick and into the marrow of her being. Her A-10C Thunderbolt II call sign, Hog 2-1, was a beast of the earth, not the heavens. It belonged down here in the mud and the grit, where wars were truly won and lost. The radio, a constant companion, crackled with the clipped professional calm of men directing death from miles away. Hog 2-1, this is Sentinel. Enemy armor column spotted grid 479er. They're boxing in Ranger platoon. Danger close. You are cleared hot. Katerina's gloved thumb moved with an economy born of 1,000 hours of practice flicking switches on the HOTAS. Sentinel Hog 2-1 copies. Cleared hot. I'm inbound. She banked the Warthog a slow predatory turn that felt more like a battleship changing course than an aircraft maneuvering. The twin General Electric engines whined behind her, a familiar chorus of immense power. Below the T-80 tanks were ants crawling along a dusty ribbon of a road, their turrets turning searching. The Rangers were pinned down in a rocky outcrop, their position marked by plumes of purple smoke. Danger close. The words were an understatement. The friendlies were practically spitting distance from the enemy. This was her domain. The space between heaven and hell, where the margin for error was measured in meters and paid for in lives. Visual on the smoke. She murmured, her voice a low rasp, barely used that day. Rolling in north to south. She pushed the nose down. The world tilted the G-force, pressing her into her seat like a giant, insistent hand. The 30mm GAU-8 Avenger cannon, the soul of her aircraft, was armed. 7 barrels of depleted uranium shells ready to sing their apocalyptic song. The famed brrrt was a sound of salvation for the men on the ground, a sound of finality for those in its path. Her eyes scanned the threat display. Her mind a cold calculus of altitude, airspeed, and angles. Everything was clean. Too clean. The Gerovian Federation had been surprisingly quiet in the air today. Complacent. The first shells ripped into the lead tank, a flicker of orange against the dull green camouflage. The tank shuddered, its turret blown clean off in a geyser of fire and smoke. She pulled up the Warthog, groaning under the strain, and prepared for a second pass on the next vehicle. That's when the world went sideways. There was no warning, no missile lock tone, no frantic RWR scream, just a sudden violent thump that felt like a sledgehammer striking the fuselage. The aircraft bucked violently, throwing her against her restraints. A cacophony of alarms blared to life in the cockpit, a symphony of electronic panic. The right engine temperature was spiking, a cascade of red lights flooding her master caution panel. Sentinel Hog, Taktintitomksnim. 1 taking fire, taking heavy fire. Her voice was steady, betraying none of the cold adrenaline that now flooded her veins. She fought the stick, the controls turning sluggish and heavy. The Warthog wanted to roll over and die, to spiral into the unforgiving earth. She wouldn't let it. Engine 2 is out. I've lost hydraulics on the right side. Through the canopy, she saw a fleeting glimpse of a gray dart, a sleek, needle-nosed fighter arcing away with an impossible grace. It was no stray anti-aircraft round. It was a hunter, and she was the prey. The F-16s on cap were miles away, too far to help. The CSR teams would take time to scramble. She was alone. The stick was a dead weight in her hands. Her movements answered by sluggish, painful protests from the dying aircraft. The ground rushed up to meet her, the jagged peaks no longer an abstraction on a map, but a very real, very final destination. But the A-10 was built for this. It was a flying tank designed to take punishment and bring its pilot home. Katerina had to believe in its ghost, in the will of its engineers. She dumped fuel, wrestled with the trim, and forced the Warthog's nose toward the least hostile-looking piece of ground she could find, a narrow, snow-dusted valley floor that looked just wide enough to be a runway and just long enough to be a grave. "Mayday, mayday, mayday." She broadcast her voice, a flat line of protocol. "Hog 2-1 is going down. I am attempting a forced landing at grid coordinates." She rattled them off from memory, her mind compartmentalizing, pushing the fear into a small, locked box. The landing gear wouldn't deploy. Of course it wouldn't. This would be a belly landing, a controlled crash. She skimmed the tops of the pine trees, the branches scraping against the titanium bathtub that protected her. The aircraft shuddered and groaned, a wounded animal begging for release. The valley floor was a blur of gray rock and white snow. "Here we go," she whispered to the machine, to herself, to the ghosts of everyone she had ever lost. The impact was a grinding, shrieking cataclysm of tearing metal. The world became a violent, incomprehensible storm of snow, dirt, and noise. The Warthog slid for what felt like an eternity, shedding pieces of itself along the way, its tough hide screaming in protest, before finally blessedly shuddering to a halt. Silence. A profound, deafening silence broken only by the hiss of cooling metal and the frantic beating of her own heart. The smell of leaking jet fuel and burnt electronics filled the cramped cockpit. She was alive. Bruised, battered, but alive. Katerina systematically shut down what was left of the power, her hands moving with practiced, unthinking precision. She unstrapped herself, the harness falling away like a shed skin. The canopy was jammed. She reached for the emergency jettison lever, blew the canopy clear, and a rush of frigid mountain air slapped her face. She climbed out, her boots sinking into the snow. The Warthog was a wreck, its right wing mangled, its tail shredded. But it was in one piece. It had protected her one last time. She was deep in enemy territory, alone, a survivor, again. She pulled her sidearm, her eyes scanning the silent tree-lined ridges that surrounded her. They would be coming. The hunter who had shot her down would want to confirm his kill. The ground patrols would be closing in. In the distance, she heard a new sound. The faint, piercing scream of afterburners. Friendlies. The F-16s. She looked back at her downed bird, its unique tail number stark against the gray fuselage, a nameplate for a ghost. 78-582. Let them come. Let them see. Let them remember. 20,000 feet above the Corvat spur, the world was a thing of serene geometric beauty. First Lieutenant Alex Raptor Thorne flew his F-16C Viper through the thin, frigid air, the sky around him a deep, bruised violet at the edge of space. Below the mountains were a crumpled map, their hostile peaks softened by distance into a texture he could almost run his hand over. Up here, war was clean. It was a matter of radar signatures, vector intercepts, and the cold logic of the HUD projected onto his visor. His wingman Ben Viper Carter flew a perfect combat spread off his right flank, a dark gray arrowhead against the clouds. Their call signs, Raptor and Viper, were the cocksure monikers of a new generation of pilots. Men who had grown up on simulators and stories of legends, but had yet to earn their own. "Anything on your scope?" Raptor Viper's voice was a relaxed drawl in his ear, cutting through the steady hum of the cockpit. "Negative. Just the usual commercial traffic over the border." Alex replied, his tone clipped and professional. "Sentinels got them on a leash. It's quiet. Too quiet." Ben quipped, the old pilot's cliché hanging in the air. makes a man nervous. Alex didn't reply. He wasn't nervous. He was focused. Complacency was a killer, his mentor had always told him, and his mentor, Colonel Marcus Thorne, had known a thing or two about killers. The calm was shattered by a new voice, the air controller from the AWACS plane circling high above. Raptor flight, this is Sentinel. Scramble, scramble, we have a downed aircraft friendly. I say again, friendly aircraft down. Instantly, the atmosphere in Alex's cockpit shifted. The serene beauty vanished, replaced by the sharp edges of imminent reality. His fingers danced across the controls of his MFD, bringing up the new coordinates. They were deep inside the Jarovian buffer zone. Sentinel Raptor lead copies. Alex's voice was devoid of emotion, a pure instrument of protocol. Diverting now. What's the status of the pilot? Pilot is alive, confirmed by a Mayday call, Sentinel relayed. A-10C call sign Hog 2-1. Forced down by enemy air. Hostiles may be in the vicinity. Your mission is to provide top cover for the CSR package. Sanitize the area. Nothing gets in or out. Copy, sanitize the area, Alex confirmed. He banked his Viper hard, the G-force squeezing him into his seat as he pointed his nose towards the new heading. Viper, you with me. Right behind you, lead. Let's go get our pig driver home. An A-10 pilot. Alex felt a familiar mix of respect and pity. Those pilots were a different breed, flying low and slow, inviting fire. They lived in the dirt with the grunts they protected. It was a noble, brutal job, a far cry from the sterile, high-speed duels of a fighter pilot. He mentally cycled through the roster of the 74th Fighter Squadron, the Warthog drivers. Was it Miller or the new guy Petrov? They crossed into hostile airspace at supersonic speed, two gray ghosts streaking across the roof of the world. Minutes stretched each second, thick with tension. The AWACS fed them intermittent radar data, but the enemy fighter that had downed the A-10 had vanished, likely using the deep valleys and canyons to mask its escape. A professional. Raptor, I have a visual. Ben's voice crackled. Valley at your 10 o'clock. I see wreckage. Alex followed his wingman's gaze, his eyes narrowing. He toggled his targeting pod, the sniper-like camera slaved to his helmet. The view on his MFD screen zoomed in with startling clarity. There, in a long, ugly gash of scarred earth and snow, was the A-10. It was battered, but intact, a testament to its legendary toughness. And next to it, a single solitary figure stood motionless. Sentinel Raptor confirms visual on downed aircraft and pilot, Alex reported. Pilot is on their feet, appears to be conscious. I am commencing identification pass. He eased the F-16 into a wide descending orbit around the valley, keeping a wary eye on the surrounding ridges. He needed to confirm the aircraft's identity for the record. It was procedure. Just a number. Viper, stay high. Watch my 6. You got it, lead. Alex focused the pod's crosshairs on the tail of the wrecked Warthog. The paint was scorched and smeared with dirt, but the stenciled markings were just visible. He zoomed in further, the image sharpening, the numbers resolving out of the gray blur. Sentinel confirming tail number for Hog 2-1, stand by. He read them off, his voice flat. Tail number is Juliet Tango 78-0582. He expected a quick confirmation, a solid copy from the controller. Instead, there was silence. A dead, empty space on the frequency that lasted for 3 full seconds, then 4. It was the most unnatural sound in a pilot's world. Ben's voice cut in, laced with confusion. Say again, your read, Raptor. That can't be right. Before Alex could respond, the Sentinel controller's voice returned, strained and uncertain. Raptor lead. Please confirm that tail number. Rate it back one more time. A cold knot began to tighten in Alex's stomach. This was no longer routine. He centered the crosshairs again, his gaze locked on the numbers as if they might change. They didn't. "I confirm," he said, slowly enunciating each digit with deliberate care. 7, 8, 0, 5, 8, 2. Another pause, this one even longer. Alex could hear muffled, urgent voices in the background of the AWACS transmission. Then the controller came back on his professional calm, completely gone, replaced by something akin to awe or perhaps dread. "Copy that, Raptor. Be advised, that tail number is assigned to Major Katerina Volkov. Call sign Nix." The controller hesitated, as if the next words were impossible to say. She was declared KIA 5 years ago. Operation Winter's Fury. The words hit the cockpit of the F-16 with the force of a physical blow. Ben swore softly over the radio. Jesus Christ. Nix. The ghost of Winter's Fury. Alex didn't hear him. He was frozen, his hand clenched on the stick. The world outside the canopy, the mountains, the sky, the downed Warthog seemed to recede, replaced by a memory. A funeral on a cold, gray day. A folded flag handed to a grieving widow. The face of his mentor, Colonel Thorne, in a framed photograph, the last man to speak to Nix before her squadron, was wiped off the face of the earth. He zoomed the pod in again past the tail number to the lone figure standing in the snow. The pilot looked up, her face obscured by her helmet, but her posture was one of defiance, not defeat. It wasn't just a downed pilot. It was a ghost. And his mentor had died trying to save her. The name echoed in the sterile confines of Alex's cockpit, a phantom signal overriding every system, every protocol. Nix. It wasn't a call sign. It was a scar. For 5 years, it had been a name spoken in hushed tones in the officers' club, a name etched on a black memorial wall, a name inextricably linked to the worst day of Alex's life. And now it was a living fact, standing in the snow beside the impossible wreckage of tail number 78, VV582. Alex forced his F-16 into its high orbit. The automated flight path, a steady, indifferent circle, while his mind tumbled through the chaos of the past. The calm, professional mask of Raptor the fighter pilot slipped away, leaving only Alex Thorne, the boy who had lost a father. Operation Winter's Fury. It had been the ambitious centerpiece of a counteroffensive 5 years prior, a bold stroke meant to cripple the Zerovian command structure in the region. The target was a hardened communications bunker codenamed Cerberus, nestled deep within a seemingly impenetrable mountain fortress. The mission was complex, a symphony of electronic warfare, air superiority, and brute force ground attack. Colonel Marcus Thorne, a man whose command presence was as steady as the horizon, had orchestrated it. He was the conductor, and Major Katerina Volkov was his lead soloist. Alex had been a cadet then, listening to the mission briefing from the back of the room, a privilege afforded to him as Marcus's protégé. He remembered her clearly. Nix. She hadn't been like the other pilots. While they were all swagger and sharp angles, she was a pool of stillness. She didn't speak of flight characteristics or ordnance loads. She spoke of the terrain as if it were a living thing, of enemy armor formations, as if she could feel their intent. Marcus had called her the best instinctive pilot he had ever seen. "She doesn't fly the Warthog, Alex," he'd once said. "She wears it, Her squadron of 8 A-10s were the tip of the spear, tasked with flying beneath the enemy's primary radar umbrella to deliver the bunker-busting munitions. Marcus's F-16s would hold the sky above a protective ceiling of steel. The operation began at dawn. For the first hour, everything was perfect. Then Cerberus fell silent. The intelligence had been wrong. It wasn't a command bunker. It was a trap. A sophisticated network of hidden surface-to-air missile sites and ambush fighters had been waiting for them. The enemy's legendary ace, a pilot known only as Javelin, was the orchestrator of the slaughter. The radio traffic, once a calm river of procedure, became a torrent of panic and death. Communications were jammed, targeting data corrupted. One by one, the call signs of Nix's squadron winked out. It was a massacre in the valleys, a bloodbath hidden from the F-16s circling helplessly above. Marcus Thorne, bound by the rules of engagement and the orders of his superiors, was told to pull back, to cut his losses. But he heard her final desperate transmission cut through the static. Her voice, for the first and only time, frayed with strain, calling out enemy positions even as her squadron disintegrated around her. He made a choice. The choice that had defined his legacy and ended his life. "I'm going in!" He had broadcast his voice, a cold, hard declaration that tolerated no argument. He broke formation, diving his F-16 into the hornet's nest, a lone guardian angel descending into hell. The last anyone heard from him was a garbled transmission shredded by jamming. "Get her out. Nix, you have to. Legacy." Then nothing. His signal vanished. Moments later, so did hers. When the dust settled, the losses were catastrophic. 7 A-10s and 1 F-16 were gone. No bodies were recovered from the deepest engagement zones, including Volkov's. She was declared killed in action, alongside the men she led and the commander who tried to save her. The operation was a stain on the Air Force's record, and Nix became a myth, the ghost pilot of a doomed squadron the woman Marcus Thorne had died for. For Alex, the grief was a physical void. Marcus hadn't just been his commander and mentor. He was his godfather, the man who had taken him in when his own military parents had been killed in a transport crash years before. Marcus had taught him to fly, to lead, to be a man of honor. And in Alex's grieving mind, a bitter narrative had taken root. Marcus, the consummate professional, had broken every rule for one pilot. For her. He had traded his life for a ghost. "Raptor, this is Sentinel. CSAR package is inbound 5 minutes out. How's our survivor look?" The controller's voice yanked Alex back to the present. He forced the memories down, locking them away behind a wall of cold duty. "Sentinel survivor is stationary. No visible distress signals," he reported, his voice a monotone. He looked at the lone figure in the snow. She hadn't moved. She was waiting, patient, as if she knew they would come. "Viper, you see those ridges to the east? I don't like them. Make a low pass, see if you can shake anything loose. I'll cover the jollies on their approach." "Copy, lead," Ben replied, his voice subdued. He too knew the story of Winter's fury. Every pilot at the base did. As Alex watched his wingman peel away, he kept his targeting pod locked on the woman below. She was the missing piece of a puzzle he had spent 5 years trying to solve, the living embodiment of his deepest wound. He had mourned the legend, cursed the memory, but he had never imagined he would have to face the woman herself. The distant, rhythmic whoomp, whoomp, whoomp of helicopter blades began to echo through the valley. The rescue was coming, and with it a reckoning. The ghost was about to come home. The sound came first, a faint, rhythmic pulse that grew steadily from the south, echoing off the stone walls of the valley. It was the sound of rescue, the familiar, comforting beat of HH-60G Pavehawk blades slicing through the cold mountain air. For Katarina, standing beside the carcass of her Warthog, it was the sound of a closing parenthesis. The brief, violent period of solitude was over. Now the more complicated part would begin. From his vantage point 3 miles above, Alex watched the two helicopters' call signs, Jolly 1 and Jolly 2 Wicks, navigate the treacherous entry to the valley. They flew low and fast, hugging the terrain, their movements a masterclass in nap-of-the-earth flight. He and Ben maintained their high cover, their eyes and sensors sweeping the ridges, hunting for any sign of the Zerovian fighter or ground patrols. The sky remained empty, unnervingly so. Jolly 1 flared for a landing, its powerful rotor wash, creating a miniature blizzard, whipping snow and loose debris into a swirling vortex. Before its skids had even fully settled, two pararescue men, the famed PJs, leaped from the open side door, their rifles up, securing the immediate perimeter with swift, practiced efficiency. Two more followed, one carrying a medical pack, and they moved directly towards Katarina. She remained motionless as they approached, her sidearm still held in a low ready position. She watched their movements, their discipline. They were professionals. Only when the lead PJ was 10 feet away, raising a hand in a placating gesture, did she slowly holster her weapon. Major Volkov, the PJ, shouted over the rotor noise, his voice muffled by his helmet. He was a master sergeant, his face etched with the calm authority of a man who had done this 100 times. Katarina gave a single sharp nod. Sergeant Evans, 56th Rescue Squadron. We're here to take you home, ma'am. Are you injured? Negative, her voice was a low rasp, barely audible in the chaos. We need to get you on the bird, he said, gesturing towards the waiting helicopter. Let's get you checked out. Can you walk? Affirmative. She started towards the pave hawk, her stride stiff but steady. The second PJ, a younger medic, moved to her side, attempting to take her arm to steady her. She didn't pull away, but there was a subtle stiffening in her posture, a silent rejection of the gesture that made him withdraw his hand. The boundary was clear. Aboard the helicopter, the noise was a physical thing, a deafening wall of sound. The crew chief helped her strap into a seat near the door gunner. Sergeant Evans knelt in front of her, his helmet now off. His expression was one of practiced concern. Major, my medic needs to do a preliminary check. Standard procedure. Katarina's eyes, a pale, piercing gray, met his. They were the eyes of someone who had looked into an abyss and had not blinked. I am not injured, Sergeant. My vitals are stable. I do not require medical attention. Ma'am, with all due respect, after a shoot-down and a belly landing protocol dictates, the protocol is for pilots who need assistance. She cut him off, her voice quiet, but carrying an absolute unyielding finality. I need a communications link to your pilot. Now. Evans stared at her for a long moment. He saw the deep purple bruise forming high on her cheekbone, where her helmet had likely slammed against the canopy. He saw the faint tremor in her hands, a telltale sign of adrenaline fatigue. But he also saw the iron will in her gaze. This was not a victim of circumstance. She was an instrument of war that had been temporarily disabled, and she was already focused on her next task. He exchanged a brief knowing glance with his medic. They had extracted survivors who were screaming, crying, or in shock. This silence was somehow more unsettling. He nodded slowly. As you wish, Major. He passed her a headset, and she slipped it on, adjusting the microphone. As the pave hawk lifted off, banking sharply out of the valley, she stared out the open door. She watched the wreckage of her Warthog shrink below a broken toy in a vast, indifferent wilderness. She felt a pang not of loss for the machine, but of kinship. They had both been broken in these mountains, but they had both endured. Listening to the chatter on the command frequency, Alex followed the exfiltration. The flight back to the airbase was tense. There were no triumphant radio calls, no relieved chatter. Just the clipped professional reports from the Jolly crew. Sentinel. Jolly 1 house is RTB. Package is secure. Solid copy. Jolly. The controller replied. What is the condition of the survivor? There was a pause before the pilot responded, his voice carefully neutral. Survivor is stable. Refusing on-site medical. Alex frowned. That was unusual. Highly unusual. Shock could make people do strange things, but a flat-out refusal was a red flag. 10 minutes later, as they crossed back into friendly airspace, a new transmission came over the command net, this one from the Jolly 1 pilot directed at the base's operations center. Sky Tower, this is Jolly, son Cantel. Be advised I have Major Volkov on board. Per her request? No, her order. She is refusing transport to the base hospital. She is demanding an immediate face-to-face debriefing with the wing commander upon arrival. Please advise. Alex felt a chill that had nothing to do with the altitude. A pilot shot down alone in enemy territory, and her first priority was not safety or medical care, but a demand to see the highest-ranking officer on the base. A ghost did not return from the grave by accident. She had come back with a purpose, and the entire base from the commanding general down to the lowest airman was about to find out what it was. The Pave Hawk didn't land on the main flight line with the other returning aircraft. It was directed to a remote, isolated hardstand near the base's command section, a place reserved for visiting dignitaries and discreet personnel transfers. As the helicopter's wheels touched down its engines, already spooling down, it was clear that Katarina's return was being treated less like a rescue and more like a sensitive intelligence operation. A single black staff car was waiting on the tarmac, its engine idling, sending small puffs of exhaust into the cold evening air. Beside it stood Brigadier General Madsen, the wing commander. He was a tall, severe man from the old guard, his face a roadmap of scowls and hard decisions. He wore his service cap low, casting a deep shadow over his eyes. He was alone. No welcoming committee, no medics, just a silent, imposing reception of one. When Katarina stepped out of the helicopter, the rotor wash whipping at her torn flight suit, she looked like an apparition. The setting sun cast a long, distorted shadow behind her. She was pale beneath the grease and grime, and the bruise on her cheek was now a dark, ugly violet. But she walked with a straight-backed, unbroken gait, ignoring the flight surgeon, who made a hesitant move towards her. Her focus was entirely on the general. She came to a halt 3 feet in front of him, her posture a perfect, if slightly stiff representation of military bearing. The silence between them was thick with 5 years of unspoken history. Major Volkov Madsen began, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that offered no warmth. You've managed to cause a significant complication on your first day back. I was engaged by a superior enemy aircraft and shot down, General. She replied, her voice flat and devoid of any defensive tone. The complication was not of my choosing. Madsen's jaw tightened. You were reactivated as a quiet tactical asset, Major. A ghost. Your purpose was to fly under the radar, not to get your legendary call sign splashed across every intelligence report from here to the capital. You were supposed to be a secret. Secrets have a way of getting loud when they're hit with a cannon shell at 10,000 feet. She countered, a flicker of something hard and dangerous in her gray eyes. She took a half-step closer. The pilot who shot me down. His technique, his discipline. I've seen it before. I know who he is. That was the sentence that changed the equation. Madsen had been prepared to reprimand her, to bury her in medical evaluations and psychological screenings, to put his resurrected ghost back in its box. But this was actionable intelligence. This was the one thing he couldn't ignore. He stared at her, his mind weighing the protocols and political fallout against the sudden, unexpected opportunity she represented. Finally, he gave a curt, angry nod and gestured with his head towards the open rear door of the car. "Get in. You wanted a debrief. You're about to get the most thorough debrief of your life." As the car pulled away, the whispers had already begun to spread across the base with the speed of a signal fire. Airmen on the flight line stopped their work mechanics, emerged from hangars, and off-duty officers paused on their way to the mess hall. They all stared at the black car, at the indistinct silhouette of the woman inside. The ghost of Winter's Fury was back. The name passed from person to person, a mixture of awe, disbelief, and a kind of superstitious dread. Alex had just parked his F-16 and was walking towards the squadron building when he saw the scene unfold. Ben caught up to him, pulling off his helmet, his face a mask of incredulity. "Would you look at that?" Ben said, shaking his head. "They're giving her the VIP treatment. You'd think she won the war single-handed, not got her bird shot out from under her. She's not a hero." Ben Alex said, his voice a low, cold fury. He couldn't take his eyes off the car. "She's a relic, a bad omen. Men died because of her. He died because of her." Just then, the staff car passed by their position. For a fraction of a second through the tinted glass, Katerina's gaze met his. There was no recognition in her eyes, no emotion at all. It was like looking at a granite cliff face, impassive, ancient, and absolute. But Alex projected onto it everything he felt: the failure, the loss, the betrayal. He poured 5 years of grief and anger into that single fleeting moment of eye contact. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, the knuckles white. He could feel the cold of the cemetery, the weight of the folded flag, the hollow emptiness left by Marcus Thorne's absence. The car continued on, disappearing behind the sterile concrete facade of the command building. Katerina felt the young pilot's stare, recognized the animosity in it, but did not let it register. It was just one more hostile force in a world full of them. She had more immediate concerns. The car stopped. Madsen led her from the vehicle and into the building. Their footsteps echoed down the long, silent corridor, past classified maps and portraits of past commanders. It was a hall of ghosts, and she was merely the newest one to walk it. They stopped outside a heavy windowless door marked S2 Debriefing. Madsen pushed it open, revealing a small, bare room containing nothing but a steel table and 3 chairs. "The intelligence officers are on their way," he said, his voice hard. "You will tell them everything. And Major," he added, pausing in the doorway, "do not for 1 second think this changes anything. You are a liability, and I will not lose another officer for you." He closed the door, leaving her alone in the silent waiting room. The unwelcome return was complete. The interrogation was about to begin. The debriefing room was a perfect cube of gray, designed for the surgical extraction of truth. A single cold fluorescent panel in the ceiling hummed with a barely audible electric current bathing the steel table and 3 chairs in a flat, shadowless light. On one wall, a pane of dark, reflective glass hid the observation room. Katerina knew there were microphones, cameras, and unseen eyes watching her every move. The room wasn't a space for conversation. It was a psychological instrument, and she was the subject being measured. She sat perfectly still, her back straight, not touching the chair back. She placed her hands on the cold surface of the table, lacing her fingers together to stop their slight tremor. She focused on her breathing, a slow, measured rhythm she had perfected in another cold, gray room long ago. It was a shield. The door opened, and 2 officers entered. The first was a man in his late 40s, Major Elias Vance of Air Force Intelligence. He had the weary, cynical eyes of a man who had spent his career sifting through the lies of pilots and the half-truths of satellite imagery. The second was a younger woman, Captain Eva Rostova, a flight psychologist whose uniform seemed a size too large for her slender frame. Her gaze was sharp, analytical, missing nothing. Vance was here for the facts. Rostova was here for the cracks. Major Volkov Vance began forgoing any pleasantries as he sat down opposite her and opened a file. Rostova sat to his right, silent, her hands folded around a pen and a blank notepad. Let's begin with the point of engagement. Walk us through it. Katerina's voice when she spoke was a steady monotone. She had partitioned the event in her mind, isolating it from the terror, and the fall, turning it into a set of pure data. I was on a north-to-south gun run in support of a Ranger platoon at grid 479er. Threat displays were clear. No early warning of an airborne hostile. No RWR signature, no missile-lock tone, Vance asked, his pen scratching across a page. None. He was either masked by the terrain or using a passive detection system. My first indication was kinetic impact, a 30mm cannon shell, I believe, high explosive incendiary. It struck the starboard engine housing and severed the primary hydraulic lines. Vance looked up, impressed by the specificity. You're certain on the caliber. The impact felt like a hammer, not a needle. It was a low-velocity, high-mass round. Classic Zhurovian design. He fired a short, precise burst. No spray. He knew exactly where to hit an A-10 to cripple it without destroying it. She continued her recall total. She described the enemy fighter's post-engagement vector, its incredible thrust-to-weight ratio, and its immediate dive into a narrow canyon to defeat any retaliatory lock. She laid out the entire event with the dispassionate clarity of a crash investigator. To Vance, it was a treasure trove of actionable intelligence about a new and highly skilled enemy pilot. To Rostova, it was deeply unnerving. The emotional detachment was a form of shock, a well-built wall against trauma. She waited for the crack. Describe the final maneuver, Vance instructed, the one that allowed him to get into gun range undetected. Katerina paused, her eyes unfocusing for a fraction of a second, as she replayed the moment in her mind's eye. He didn't use a standard attack profile. He came over the western ridge, but instead of diving on my 6, he performed a high G negative alpha roll. He bled his energy, deliberately forcing his aircraft into what looked like the beginning of an unrecoverable stall. A falling leaf. The words hung in the air. Falling leaf. The humming fluorescent light above her seemed to dim. The gray walls of the debriefing room dissolved, replaced by a suffocating, damp darkness. Say, she is in a different chair, this one cold steel, its edges sharp against her wrists. The air is thick with the smell of wet concrete and mildew. A single drop of water falls from the ceiling onto the floor with a rhythmic, maddening slowness. A man stands in the shadows, just beyond the reach of the bare bulb hanging above her. She can't see his face, only his silhouette. He is her interrogator. He hasn't laid a hand on her for days. The physical torment was crude, ineffective. Now he was trying to dismantle her mind. He speaks in her native tongue, his voice calm, academic, almost gentle. The mistake your Western pilots make, he says, his voice a soft poison, is believing the sky is a two-dimensional chessboard. Predictable. You follow the rules of energy and altitude. You live by your flight manuals. But the sky is a living thing. It has moods. It has currents. Our best pilots, they do not fight the sky. They dance with it. He steps forward just enough for the light to catch the cruel intelligence in his eyes. Consider the falling leaf. You see it as a sign of weakness, an aircraft out of control, a pilot in peril. But for a master, it is a disguise. It is a moment of perfect calculated chaos. While your systems scream, "Stall," he is lining up his killing shot. It is a tactic of psychological disorientation, a signature of our finest pilot. You call him Javelin. Major, Captain Rostova's voice was a sharp pinprick, pulling her back from the edge of the memory. Katerina blinked. The gray room solidified around her. The faces of Vance and Rostova were watching her, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and concern. A single bead of sweat traced a line down her temple. "Is there something else, Major Volkov?" Rostova asked softly. Katerina's composure returned in an instant, the wall slamming back into place. Her hands, which had tightened into fists on the table, relaxed. "No," she said, her voice perfectly level. That was his maneuver. A falling leaf. It was effective. She finished the debrief, answering Vance's remaining questions with the same cold precision as before. When it was over, he closed his file, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. "Thank you, Major. This has been very valuable." They stood and walked to the door. Vance was already discussing threat profile updates with a subordinate on his radio. But Rostova paused and looked back not at Katerina, but at the dark reflection in the one-way mirror. She saw the Major sitting alone at the table, a solitary, unmoving figure. The tactical report was flawless, Rostova thought to herself. But the ghost of Winter's fury hadn't just brought back intelligence. She had brought back her wounds, and they were still wide open. Sleep offered Alex no escape. Every time he closed his eyes, he was back in the cockpit of his F-16, the impossible tail number resolving out of the blur. Or he was a boy again, standing graveside, the sharp, creased edges of a folded flag pressing into his hands. The ghost of Katerina Volkov had breached the walls of the airbase, but it had also breached the walls of his mind, taking up residence in the spaces that had for 5 years been occupied by grief and a cold, carefully constructed certainty. That certainty was now fractured. He threw off his covers, the air in his Spartan officers' quarters, feeling thin and suffocating. A single question burned in the darkness: why now? Why, after 5 years of silence, had she returned? And why did her presence feel less like a miracle and more like the first tremor of an earthquake? The official story, the one he had built his understanding of Marcus Thorne's death upon, suddenly felt too simple, too neat. Bad intelligence. A tragic loss. A heroic sacrifice. It was a story designed to close a wound, to file away a disaster under lessons learned. But a living ghost defied such tidy conclusions. Driven by a need he didn't fully understand, Alex dressed and walked through the quiet sleeping base under the harsh glare of the security lights. His destination was a squat, windowless building at the edge of the command section, the secure archives. The non-commissioned officer on duty, a tech sergeant with tired eyes, looked up from his novel as Alex entered. "Lieutenant Thorne." "Bit late for a history lesson, isn't it?" "Couldn't sleep," Sergeant Alex replied, sliding his ID card into the scanner. "I need to review the after-action reports for Operation Winter's Fury." The sergeant raised an eyebrow. The request was unusual, but Alex's security clearance was sufficient, and his connection to Colonel Thorne was well known. It was filed under the unwritten rules of professional courtesy. He grunted and tapped a few keys on his terminal. "The digital annex is unlocked for you. Terminal 4. You have 2 hours." Inside the cold, climate-controlled room, Alex sat before a secure terminal, the hum of the servers a low, constant drone. He typed in the operation name. A cascade of files appeared, a digital tombstone for dozens of men. He started with the official summary, the document he had read years ago. It told the familiar, sanitized story of heroism in the face of insurmountable odds. But Alex wasn't an administrator. He was a pilot. He began to dig deeper into the raw telemetry, the tactical overlays, the unedited comms logs, and he started to find the ghosts in the machine. The first inconsistency was in the flight paths. He pulled up the 3D tactical plot, a web of green and red lines tracing the squadron's final moments through the mountain valleys. The official report stated that Major Volkov's squadron had deviated from the planned ingress route due to navigational challenges. But as Alex replayed the data, he saw something else. Nix's flight of 8 Warthogs had made a sharp 90-degree turn away from the target just moments before the first SAM launch. It wasn't a gentle drift. It was a violent, deliberate break. It looked less like an error and more like she was reacting to something that wasn't on any of their radars. Next, he turned to the communication logs. They were a mess of static and overlapping panicked calls. But the most critical moments, the final exchange between Colonel Thorne and Major Volkov, were almost entirely blacked out. Thick digital blocks of redaction covered the transcripts, citing classified ongoing source protection. 5 years later, that excuse seemed flimsy. What source was still being protected at the cost of the mission's truth? What had Marcus said to her in those final seconds? He cross-referenced the redaction times with the telemetry and found that the blackout corresponded exactly with Marcus Thorne's solo dive into the valley. His commander had gone dark intentionally to have one final private conversation with his doomed squadron leader. A conversation the Air Force had seen fit to bury forever. The final piece clicked into place when he dug into the personnel files attached to the report. He found the preliminary witness statement of a young F-16 pilot, a Lieutenant Jacobs, who had been flying on Marcus's wing. Jacobs had been medically discharged a month after the operation for severe post-traumatic stress. His initial debrief, given just hours after the mission, while he was still in shock, was a raw, unfiltered account. Alex scrolled down the page, his eyes scanning the clinical text, until he found it. A single explosive sentence that was conspicuously absent from the final report. Shai Jacobs claims to have heard Colonel Thorne's final transmission before enemy jamming became absolute. The colonel allegedly shouted, "It's a setup, Nix, they sold us out. Get clear." Alex leaned back in his chair, the sterile air of the archive suddenly feeling heavy and cold. They sold us out. It wasn't a mistake. It was a betrayal. The neat, honorable narrative of his mentor's death shattered. Marcus hadn't died because of a simple intelligence failure. He hadn't sacrificed himself just to save one pilot. He had died trying to warn her about a conspiracy that went high enough to sanitize the official records and bury the truth under 5 years of silence and black ink. He stared at the screen at the redacted lines and the ghost of a warning. His animosity for Katerina Volkov, the cold, hard anger he had nursed for years, began to curdle into something far more complex and unsettling. She wasn't the cause of the disaster. She was the only other survivor of it. The question was no longer what she had done. The question was what she knew. And Alex realized with a dawning sense of dread that the enemy wasn't just the shadowy Jerovian ace who had returned. The enemy might be much, much closer to home. The hangar was a cathedral of steel and shadows, the air thick with the sacramental smells of hydraulic fluid grease and ozone. After the sterile confines of the debriefing room, Katerina had been released into a state of limbo, assigned temporary quarters she had no intention of using. Instead, she was drawn here to the only place on base that felt remotely like a sanctuary. Her Warthog sat in the center of the vast space, bathed in the stark, lonely glare of overhead maintenance lights. Up close, the damage was breathtaking. It wasn't just a machine with holes in it. It was a body savaged and broken. The right wing was twisted at an unnatural angle, and the fuselage behind the cockpit was a mangled landscape of torn metal and severed wires. The gray paint scorched black in a pattern that looked like a giant claw mark. It looked like a beast that had fought something terrible, and by some miracle had crawled home to die. Katerina walked its perimeter slowly, a general inspecting a fallen soldier. She didn't need to read a technician's report to understand the wounds. She had felt each one as if it were her own flesh. The shudder of the cannon shell's impact, the grinding protest of the landing, the final shuddering halt. This machine had been her armor, her other self, for hundreds of hours. It had absorbed the fury that had been meant for her. She stopped near the cockpit and reached out her gloved fingers, gently tracing the rim of a jagged hole just below the canopy. The metal was cold and sharp. She leaned her forehead against the fuselage, closing her eyes. The cold seeped through her flight suit, a familiar grounding sensation. For a single unguarded moment, the weight of the last 5 years, the capture, the interrogation, the hiding, the constant grinding vigilance pressed down on her. The unyielding mask of Major Nix Volkov. The ghost pilot cracked, and beneath it was only Katerina, a woman who was profoundly, shatteringly tired. She took one hell of a beating, Major. The voice was low and raspy, emerging from the hangar's shadows. It held no surprise, no judgment, only a deep, resonant familiarity. Katerina didn't startle. She didn't have to turn to know who it was. Chief Master Sergeant Elias Costas. He was a fixture in the A-10 community, a crew chief who had been working on these planes since they first rolled off the line. His hands knew every rivet and wire, and his memory held the ghosts of every pilot who had ever flown them. He had been Marcus Thorne's friend, and he had been her crew chief during winter's fury. She straightened up, but kept her hand on the Warthog's skin. She did her job, Chief. Elias emerged into the light, wiping his hands on a greasy rag. He was shorter than she remembered, his back a little more stooped, but his eyes were the same, a clear, steady blue that saw everything and said little. He walked over and stood beside her, his gaze clinical but compassionate as he surveyed the damage. "They don't make 'em like this anymore," he said, his voice a quiet rumble. "Not the planes, not the pilots." He tapped a spot on the nose cone where the paint was worn away. "Remember when that flock of geese tried to take you out over the training range, bent the whole damn pitot tube sideways? You still landed her on a dime." She offered the barest hint of a smile, a memory from another lifetime. "You had it fixed in an hour. This is going to take more than an hour," he said, his gaze drifting to the shredded engine housing. "Main spars got a fracture. Hydraulics are a total loss. Avionics are fried. She's torn up bad, Major. Real bad." He paused, then looked from the wreckage to her. But the cockpit's untouched. The titanium bathtub did its work. Hearts still beating. The words were about the plane, but the meaning was for her. It was his way of saying he saw her, the survivor, inside the wreckage. He didn't ask where she had been. He didn't mention the official reports or the KIA status. The questions were irrelevant. The simple, unbelievable fact of her standing here was enough. He jerked his thumb towards a small, cluttered office at the edge of the hangar. "Coffee's probably burnt, but it's hot. Come on." For a moment she hesitated. Accepting the offer felt like admitting a need, a crack in her self-imposed isolation. But Elias's quiet, unconditional acceptance was a balm she hadn't realized she desperately needed. She gave a slow nod and followed him. Inside the office, amidst the smell of stale coffee and the organized chaos of technical manuals, he handed her a thick ceramic mug. The coffee was as terrible as he'd promised, but it was warm in her hands. They stood in a comfortable silence for a long time, two veterans sharing a quiet vigil. "The Colonel," Elias finally said, his voice soft. His eyes on a faded photograph on the wall, a younger Elias with his arm around a smiling Marcus Thorne. "He always said you could hear the ground talk when you flew. that you felt what was coming. He took a slow sip of his coffee. He would have been real glad you made it back, Major. No matter the cost. It was the first time since her return that anyone had spoken of Marcus with anything other than blame or suspicion in relation to her. The simple, unvarnished sincerity of the words struck her with a surprising force, a small point of warmth in a universe of cold. She looked out the office window at the broken machine under the lights. I just wish I could have brought him back too, Chief. The admission was quiet, almost a whisper. But it was the most she had revealed to anyone. A glimmer of the profound guilt she carried finally allowed into the light. Elias simply nodded, understanding that some things required no reply. While the rest of the airbase slept fitfully haunted by the return of its own ghost, the intelligence section was wide awake and buzzing with a manic, caffeinated energy. The raw data from Major Volkov's debrief had been a bomb thrown into the quiet, predictable rhythm of their operations. For years, the Jarovian threat had been a known quantity, competent but conventional. The pilot Katarina had described was something else entirely. Major Elias Vance. His eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep, stood before a massive holographic display table, the centerpiece of the Intelligence Fusion Center. On it, a 3D tactical map of the Korvat Spur glowed with icons and data streams. He replayed the telemetry from Katarina's Warthog and the fragmented sensor data from Alex's F-16, watching the phantom signature of the enemy fighter. "Run it again," he ordered a young analyst sitting at a nearby console. A red line representing the enemy ace materialized over the mountains. It performed the same impossible maneuver, a high G roll into a controlled falling leaf descent that bled off speed at a terrifying rate, positioning him perfectly for a lethal close-range cannon shot. It was elegant, suicidally risky, and utterly brilliant. No Jarovian pilot in our active database flies like that, the analyst confirmed, shaking her head. Their doctrine is all about energy conservation and standoff missile attacks. This is artistic. It's personal. Art gets you killed, Vance grumbled, though he didn't believe it. This pilot's art was deadly. There has to be a precedent. Cross-reference the maneuver profile with all hostile engagement data from the last conflict. Widen the search parameters. Look for anything, even fragments, that match this kinematic signature. He was hunting for a ghost of his own. Pilots, especially aces, were like master painters. Over time, they developed a unique style, a signature in the way they moved through the sky. This pilot's signature was a flourish of beautiful, calculated madness. Hours passed. The system churned through petabytes of old data, forgotten skirmishes, and redacted reports. Finally, just after dawn, the analyst called out, "Sir, I have a match. A strong one." Vance was at her side in an instant. On her screen was a file flagged with the highest levels of classification. There was no name, no photograph, only a call sign, Javelin. The file was mostly empty, a collection of unconfirmed sightings and intelligence fragments. But the data attached to it was damning. It included telemetry from the opening moments of Operation Winter's Fury before the jamming became absolute. The analyst overlaid the old data with the new. 2 lines, one from 5 years ago, one from yesterday, traced the exact same aerial signature, the same impossible falling leaf maneuver. They were a perfect match. "My God," Vance whispered, "it's him. Javelin. The architect of the Winter's Fury ambush. The shadowy ace who had single-handedly dismantled an entire A-10 squadron and then vanished without a trace. He had been a phantom, a legend the Jarovians never officially acknowledged, and that their own intelligence services had never been able to identify. And he was back. The implications hit Vance with the force of a physical blow. Katarina Volkov's shoot-down wasn't random. It was a message. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed the data tablet and went straight to the wing commander's office. General Madsen was already at his desk, a cup of black coffee in his hand, his expression thunderous. The news of a resurrected pilot had already put him in a foul mood. Vance's report was about to make it infinitely worse. "What is it?" Major Madsen asked, his tone leaving no room for small talk. "General, we've identified the pilot who shot down Major Volkov," Vance said, placing the tablet on the desk. "I think you need to see this." Madsen watched the tactical replay, his frown deepening. He listened as Vance laid out the evidence, the identical signatures separated by 5 years of silence. When Vance finished, the general leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking in the quiet office. The anger in his eyes was replaced by a cold, heavy gravity. "Javelin," he said, the name tasting like ash. "We all thought he was dead, or a damn myth. He's real, General. And he's back in our skies," Vance confirmed. "The question is why. And why now? And was Volkov his intended target?" Madsen mused, staring out the window at the flight line. "Does he know who he shot down? Is this the Zerovians signaling an escalation? Or is it a coincidence, a ghost from the past shooting down another ghost?" The strategic situation had changed in a single stroke. This was no longer just about managing the political fallout of a secret pilot's return. This was about the re-emergence of the single most dangerous enemy pilot they had ever faced. A man who had humiliated them once, and was now, it seemed, poised to do it again. Madsen's gaze fell upon a single A-10 being towed from a hangar preparing for a morning sortie. His mind was a whirlwind of calculations and unwelcome conclusions. He was facing a legendary enemy, a ghost who had mastered the art of the ambush. And the only person under his command who had ever faced that ghost in the sky, who had survived his masterpiece of a trap, was sitting in a guarded room, a psychological powder keg, waiting for a spark. He was trapped. The asset he had tried to bury, the woman he considered his greatest liability, had just become his single most indispensable weapon. The briefing room was small, soundproofed, and reserved for conversations that could alter the course of a conflict. It was known colloquially as the Vault. General Madsen stood at the head of a polished mahogany table, a grim patriarch presiding over a dysfunctional family. Major Vance stood beside him, a silent sentinel of intelligence. At one end of the table sat Katerina, a still solitary island. At the far opposite end sat Alex, his posture rigid, his jaw set so tightly a muscle jumped in his cheek. The air between them was a vacuum cold and charged with a dangerous potential. Madsen didn't waste time on preliminaries. He gestured to the large screen behind him, which displayed a single ominous file photo, the ghostly, unidentifiable silhouette of the Zerovian Aces fighter. As of 0600 hours this morning, the individual known as Javelin is designated a high-value target. Madsen began his voice, leaving no room for debate. His re-emergence is not a coincidence. It is a strategic escalation. We will not wait for him to choose his next target. We will hunt him down, and we will eliminate him. To that end, I am forming a dedicated hunter-killer flight. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the two pilots. This is not a standard sortie. The rules of engagement are being rewritten for this assignment. The objective is singular: remove Javelin from the board. Permanently. His eyes settled on Katerina. Major Volkov, you are the only pilot in this command who has survived a direct engagement with Javelin. You have seen his tactics, you felt his style. You better than anyone can anticipate his moves. You will be the hunter. Your A-10 will be the bait, the hound that flushes the target out of the canyons he loves to hide in. Then he turned his gaze to Alex. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Lieutenant Thorne, you and your flight are the sharpest Viper pilots we have. You have the speed, the systems, and the skill set. You will be the killer. You will fly high cover, you will be Major Volkov's guardian, and when she draws him out, you will deliver the killing blow. A stunned silence filled the room. Alex stared at the general, his expression a mask of disbelief that was rapidly hardening into rage. He was being ordered to protect her, to be a shield for the woman he held responsible for Marcus Thorne's death. The irony was so bitter, so cruel, it felt like a physical blow. General Alex said, his voice tight and strained with all due respect. My flight is ready for the kill mission, but a solo A-10 as bait is the plan. Lieutenant Madsen cut him off, his voice like flint. And you will be her escort. Your personal history is noted. It is also irrelevant. This is not a debate. Javelin is a strategic threat that outweighs everything else. I am putting my two best assets for this specific problem on the board together. You will find a way to function. That is a direct order. Am I understood? Alex's throat worked, but the words of protest died before they could be spoken. He saw the finality in Madsen's eyes. He was trapped. Yes, General, he clipped out the words, tasting like poison. Throughout the exchange, Katerina had not moved. Her face remained a blank canvas, her eyes fixed on the target file on the screen. She accepted the order with a single, almost imperceptible nod. Internally, she acknowledged the brutal logic of the plan. She knew Javelin's predatory instincts. An A-10 flying low and seemingly vulnerable was a temptation he would not be able to resist. She needed the F-16s. She needed a weapon she could aim at her ghost. That the weapon hated her was simply another complication in a life built of them. Good, Madsen said, sensing the fragile explosive truce. Vance will give you the full intelligence package. I want a preliminary tactical plan on my desk in 3 hours. Dismissed. The general and Vance left the room, leaving the two pilots alone in the oppressive silence. The air crackled with unspoken resentment. Alex stood up, shoving his chair back with a grating screech. He walked around the table until he stood directly in front of her, forcing her to look up at him. His voice was a low, venomous whisper. Let's get one thing clear, Major. I don't care about your legend. I'm not here to save you. My mission is to kill Javelin. You are a tool to achieve that objective. A piece of bait on a hook. You will fly the profile I designed for you. You will listen to my commands, and you will try not to get yourself shot down again. I am not my godfather. I will not throw my life away for you. Katerina rose slowly from her chair, her movements fluid and deliberate. She met his furious gaze, and her pale gray eyes were like chips of ice, calm and cutting. Your godfather died because he was an honorable man. Lieutenant, she said, her voice quiet but carrying an immense weight. He made a choice. He was not a victim, and I was not his mistake. So let us get one thing clear. You know nothing about what happened 5 years ago. You can fly your patterns, and you can be my escort. But you will stay out of my cockpit, and you will stay out of my head. I am not the one you should be afraid of. She brushed past him and walked out of the room, leaving him standing alone, his anger warring with the unsettling authority in her words. The alliance had been forged, not in trust or respect, but in the shared burning need to hunt the same ghost for entirely different reasons. Their war with Javelin had not yet begun, but the war between them was already raging. The tactical planning room was a sterile environment, a space where war was meant to be stripped of its chaos and reduced to a set of controllable variables. A large illuminated map table displayed the jagged topography of the border region in holographic blue light. Alex was already there, a conductor orchestrating a silent symphony of data. He had plotted ingress routes, defined kill boxes, and established combat air patrol ladders with a geometric precision that was both brilliant and utterly rigid. His plan was a textbook example of fourth-generation air combat doctrine. He would use Katarina's A-10 as a lure, yes, but on his terms. She would fly a predictable, prescribed route through a wide-open valley, a shooting gallery. This would allow his F-16s perched invisibly at high altitude to have a clean radar picture and a perfect firing solution when Javelin inevitably appeared. The plan was about control. It was designed to turn the enemy's aggression into a fatal mathematical certainty. Katarina entered the room an hour later, moving with a quiet purpose that seemed to absorb the ambient light. Chief Elias Kostas was with her not as a participant, but as a silent shadow of support. He handed her a data slate with the specifications of her newly assigned Warthog before retreating to a corner, a silent observer. Alex didn't acknowledge her beyond a curt nod. He launched directly into the briefing, his voice crisp and authoritative, as he pointed to the glowing lines on the map. He explained the flight paths, the rules of engagement, the fail-safes. It was a lecture, not a collaboration. Katarina listened without interruption. Her arms crossed her expression, as placid and unreadable as a frozen lake. When he finished, a self-satisfied, challenging look in his eyes, she was silent for a long moment. The only sound was the faint hum of the map table. "No," she said finally. Her voice was quiet, but it landed in the room with the force of a hammer blow. "This plan will fail, and we will all die." Alex's face flushed with anger. "That is a tactically sound, data-driven approach, Major. It maximizes our strengths and exploits the enemy's predicted." "You are planning for a textbook," she interrupted, walking forward until she stood opposite him across the glowing map. "Javelin doesn't read the textbook. He writes it. You're treating this like a duel, an honorable contest between fencers. Javelin is not a fencer. He's a poacher. He hunts." Her gaze was intense, her words carrying the weight of hard-won, traumatic experience. A poacher doesn't walk into a clearing and challenge the stag. He waits downwind. He uses the terrain. He attacks from an angle the prey can never anticipate. Your plan? He will smell this trap from 20 miles away. An A-10 flying a perfectly straight line in a wide valley, he'll know it's bait. He's not an idiot. Alex recoiled as if struck. "And your alternative, are we to simply fly around and hope we get lucky?" Katarina reached out and with a sweep of her hand erased Alex's meticulously drawn kill box from the map. The lines of light vanished. "No. We do not hope. We hunt the hunter." She zoomed the map in, not on the wide valleys, but on a chaotic, tangled maze of intersecting ravines and sharp granite ridges to the east, a place pilots called the Tangle. It was a nightmare for modern avionics, a place where radar was useless and engagements happened at knife-fighting range. "He will be here," she stated, not as a theory, but as a fact, in the clutter, in the confusion. Where speed is a disadvantage and technology is a liability. He wants a brawl in a dark alley, not a battle in an open field. That is where he killed my squadron. She began to trace a new flight path with her finger, an erratic wandering line that seemed to have no purpose. "I will go in alone. I will appear lost. A damaged bird separated from its flight trying to find its way home. My flying will be imperfect. I will give him the one thing a predator cannot resist, the illusion of a free meal." She looked directly at Alex, her eyes boring into his. "You want me to be bait? Then I will be the most convincing bait he has ever seen. Your vipers will not be circling overhead like vultures. You will be down on the deck with me. You will use the same terrain to mask your approach, staying miles behind silent. You will only move in when he is completely focused on me, when he is deep in his attack, run his fangs sunk into my wing. You have to give him the kill. You have to let him believe until the last possible second that he has won. Alex stared at her, appalled. Her plan was anathema to everything he had ever been taught. It was reckless, undisciplined. It relied on psychology, not geometry. It ceded the initiative entirely to the enemy. You're insane, he breathed, his voice a mix of fury and disbelief. You want me to take my flight into a radar dead zone with no situational awareness and trust that your instinct will tell us when to engage. You want me to let a hostile get within gun range of a friendly asset before I intervene, after what happened last time. The final 3 words were a deliberate, vicious jab meant to wound. Katerina's expression didn't change, but Elias shifted uncomfortably in the corner. Last time, she said, her voice dangerously soft. Your godfather was commanding a flight of pilots. I am proposing a hunt. They are not the same thing. One requires rules. The other requires an understanding of the beast. They stood frozen on opposite sides of the map, a chasm of philosophy and experience between them. He, the master of the modern rulebook, and she, the survivor of a monster who had torn that rulebook to shreds. The storm had arrived not in the skies above the mountains, but right here in the cold, quiet confines of the planning room. A tense, unspoken compromise had been reached in the planning room. They would use Katerina's strategy, but Alex would keep his F-16s closer than she wanted a leash of his own design on her calculated chaos. Now in the air, the theory had become a terrifying reality. The sky was a low, oppressive ceiling of bruised gray clouds that seemed to press down on the mountains, funneling the world into the tight, claustrophobic confines of the ravines below. Katerina's A-10, a fresh bird that felt alien and unfamiliar compared to her last, moved through the narrow corridors of rock. She was flying a masterful deception, making the 17-ton attack jet seem clumsy, hesitant. She kept her speed low, her turns a little too wide, her flight path that of a pilot who was lost and scared. She deliberately clipped a high ridge with her wingtip. The screech of metal on rock and the shower of orange sparks was a calculated error, an advertisement of incompetence. Over the comms, she let a slight tremor enter her voice. Sentinel. I think I've lost my bearings in this soup. It was all part of the performance. She was playing the wounded doe, making a show of her vulnerability. Every shadow that flickered across her canopy, every gust of wind that buffeted the Warthog felt like the precursor to an attack. The waiting was a form of torture, miles behind and 1,000 feet above. Alex flew a tight, anxious orbit, his frustration a physical weight in his chest. Just as she had predicted, his state-of-the-art radar was a mess of ground clutter and false returns. He was effectively blind, relying solely on her position and her word. He hated the feeling of powerlessness, of being a weapon wielded by someone else. Anything Raptor Viper's voice crackled tight with tension. This feels like we're fishing with the whole damn fleet. Negative. Stay sharp. Alex bit back his eyes, scanning the endless maze of rock. He was trusting the ghost, and it went against every fiber of his being. The contact, when it came, was not a warning tone or a radar blip. It was a flicker of motion, a change in the texture of the gray rock wall to Katerina's left. A predator detaching itself from the camouflage of the landscape. It was sleek, deadly, and it moved with a serpentine grace. Katerina's heart hammered against her ribs, but her voice on the secure frequency was as calm and cold as a frozen river. Contact. Tally 1. Low, my 8 o'clock closing fast. He's taking the bait. The hunt began. Javelin didn't make a straight-in attack run. He toyed with her. He dipped behind a ridge, vanishing completely, only to reappear moments later from a different direction, forcing her to react. It was a test of her nerve, a psychological probing for weakness. He was a wolf circling a caribou, watching its every twitch, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Alex saw him now, a fleeting gray dart weaving through the canyons, always keeping the bulky A-10 between himself and the F-16s. He was a master of the terrain, a ghost in his own element. "I can't get a lock," Alex growled in frustration. "He's not giving me a shot." "Don't take the shot." Katarina's voice came back steady and commanding. "Wait. Let him commit." Javelin closed the distance, his movements becoming more aggressive. He was done playing. He settled in 6 o'clock. Low, the classic position for a killing blow. This was the moment of truth. Any sane pilot in Katarina's position would brake hard, pulling high G turns to evade, to run for the safety of open sky. Instead, Katarina did the unthinkable. She throttled back. She dropped her landing flaps partway, a high-drag maneuver that bled her speed at an astonishing rate. The A-10, already slow, seemed to hang in the air, a huge stationary target. The move was so unexpected, so contrary to every law of self-preservation, that it caught Javelin completely by surprise. He was built for speed. His sleek fighter couldn't decelerate that fast. He was forced to overshoot his aircraft, screaming past her wing in a blur of gray metal. To avoid crashing into the canyon wall ahead, he had to pull into a hard, vertical climb. For 2 critical seconds, his flight path was predictable. His belly was exposed. He was a target. Now Raptor Katarina's voice was a whip crack of command. "He's all yours, Fox 2. The years of training took over. The doubt and anger in Alex vanished, replaced by the pure, cold instinct of a killer. He had already been diving, anticipating the command. He saw the window of opportunity she had created. The lock-on tone shrieked in his ear. "Raptor is engaged, missile away." He squeezed the trigger. The AIM-9X Sidewinder leaped from its rail, a streak of white smoke against the gray rock. Javelin saw it coming. He rolled his aircraft violently, dumping flares, a desperate, brilliant attempt to shake the missile. But the trap had been too perfect. He was too slow, too low, his energy depleted from the unexpected climb. The missile did not miss. The explosion was a silent, brilliant blossom of orange and black against the canyon wall, the sound swallowed by the vastness of the mountains. Debris rained down into the ravine below. A profound, echoing silence descended over the radio. Alex was breathing heavily, his knuckles white on the control stick. He had done it. He had killed the monster. But there was no elation, no surge of victory. The engagement had been too strange, a carefully choreographed execution set to her music. He scanned the sky, looking for her. He saw the A-10 no longer appearing clumsy or wounded. It was flying straight and level, climbing steadily out of the tangle of canyons, its wings solid and sure. It was a hunter emerging from the wilderness after a successful kill. The bait had become the master of the hunt. The silence that followed the explosion was heavier than any sound. In the void left by Javelin's demise, the ghosts of the past rushed in. Alex's breath hitched in his throat, the adrenaline of the kill giving way to a strange, unsettling emptiness. He had done it. He had avenged his mentor. But the victory felt hollow, the flavor of it tainted by the undeniable fact that it was her plan, her instinct, her impossible maneuver that had served the enemy's head on a platter. He swallowed, forcing his voice back into the clipped professional cadence of a flight lead. "Viper Flight, this is Raptor. Confirm kill. Target is destroyed. All call signs form up on me. We're RTB." His wingman confirmed, his voice buzzing with a triumphant energy that Alex couldn't share. As the F-16s began to wheel around to form up, his radio crackled with a different, more intimate signal. "Raptor, this is Nix. Switch to Tactical Channel 7. It was a private encrypted channel, a breach of standard communications protocol. Surprised and wary, Alex toggled the switch. "Go ahead, Nix." He expected a critique or perhaps a terse, "I told you so." Instead, her voice was quiet, somber, stripped of the iron she usually wore. "You have his instincts, Lieutenant. When the moment came, you didn't hesitate. You have his eyes." The reference was unmistakable. It was a match to a powder keg. "Don't," Alex snapped the name, catching in his throat. "Don't you dare talk about him. You have no right to his memory." "I have the only right," she replied, and the grief in her voice was so profound, so ancient, it stunned him into silence. "I was the last one to hear his voice. I am the keeper of his final words. I think it's time you heard them too." Alex flew on autopilot, his F-16 a ghost shell around him, his entire consciousness focused on her voice. "You read the files, didn't you, Alex? You saw the inconsistencies, the redacted lines. You knew the official story was a lie. It wasn't a question. What you read wasn't a cover-up of a failure. It was the cover-up of a betrayal. The intelligence for Winter's Fury wasn't just bad. It was deliberately falsified. Someone in our own command fed Javelin our ingress routes, our squadron call signs, our mission timing. It was an execution, not a battle." The words resonated with the buried testimony he had found. "They sold us out. I felt it." Katerina continued, her voice a low murmur. "The sky felt wrong. That's why I broke from the flight path. I was trying to outrun a trap I could feel but couldn't see. But it was too late." She paused, and Alex could hear the faint, ragged edge of her breath over the radio. When Marcus dove into that valley, he wasn't being a reckless hero. He saw what was happening. He knew the comms were compromised. He was buying me 30 seconds, that's all. Just enough time for one last clean transmission pilot to pilot. The sky outside Alex's canopy seemed to warp, the gray clouds twisting into the faces of the past. "His last words to me weren't an order to escape," she said, her voice now trembling with the weight of the 5-year-old memory. "They were a promise. He made me promise. He knew he was going to die. He knew they would bury the truth, that they would label the mission a failure, and him a fool. He made me promise that I would survive, that I would live no matter what it took, that I would carry the truth of what they did to him and to my pilots. He didn't die saving my life, Alex. He died investing his legacy in my survival." Her voice cracked just once. "He died so that one day I could find my way back and tell his son the truth. He died for you." The world fractured. The carefully constructed narrative Alex had built around his grief, the one that cast Katerina as the villain and Marcus as the tragic hero, disintegrated into dust. He wasn't hearing a story. He was listening to the last will and testament of his father, delivered from the ghost he had spent 5 years hating. The anger that had been his constant companion vanished, leaving a vast, aching void. He looked out his canopy to the right. Her A-10 was flying in perfect formation off his wing, a steady, resolute presence against the clouds. He no longer saw Nix, the bad omen, the ghost of failure. He saw Katerina, the custodian of a sacred vow, a woman who had endured capture, torture, and 5 years of isolation to honor the final wish of the man he loved. The weight of her solitude, of the burden she had carried alone, was crushing. They flew in silence, but it was a new kind of silence. Not the cold, hostile space between adversaries, but the shared, somber stillness of allies bound together by a truth more profound than any order. Alex keyed his mic, his voice hoarse, stripped of all its previous arrogance. The question was not for his flight lead or for an officer. It was for the keeper of his father's promise. Katerina, what do we do now? The flight back to the airbase was conducted in a new kind of silence. It was not the hostile charged space of their journey out, but a shared somber quietude thick with the gravity of the truth that now lay between them. They flew in perfect formation, two hunters returning from the dark, their shared purpose, a tangible, unbreakable bond. On the ground, news of their victory had preceded them. Javelin, the ghost who had haunted this airspace for years, was gone. As they taxied toward the hangars, they could see the crowd gathering ground crews, off-duty pilots, and support staff, their faces alight with a mixture of curiosity and triumphant relief. When Katerina and Alex climbed down from their respective cockpits, a wave of applause and cheers erupted. This time, Katerina was not met with suspicion or fear, but with awe. But the two pilots barely registered the celebration. Their gazes met over the sea of jubilant faces. Acknowledgement passed between them, a quiet understanding that the victory over Javelin was only the end of the first battle. The war for the truth was just beginning. They walked side by side towards the command building, their synchronized stride, a silent testament to their new alliance. The crowd parted for them, the pilots and airmen sensing that this was more than a simple victory debrief. The sight of the legendary Ghost and the squadron's golden boy walking as a united front was a profound and unsettling shift in the base's established order. General Madsen, watching from his office window, saw it too, and a deep, troubled frown creased his brow. In the vault, the atmosphere was electric. Madsen, for the first time, allowed a grim smile to touch his lips. A clean kill on a target we've been hunting for years. The capital is pleased. Give me the report. I want to know how you did it. He looked at Alex, expecting the young, confident ace to narrate his victory. Alex stood, but his eyes were on Katerina. General Alex began, his voice clear and steady. The success of this mission was due entirely to the strategy devised and executed by Major Volkov. Her understanding of the enemy's psychology was something no tactical database could have provided. She created the opportunity. I only took the shot. He sat down. The statement, a full-throated endorsement from the man who had been her most vocal detractor, stunned the room into silence. Madsen stared at Alex, then at Katerina, his mind struggling to process the complete reversal. Katerina picked up the narrative, giving a concise, clinical breakdown of the engagement. But when she finished, she didn't sit down. She folded her hands on the table and looked directly at the general. The tactical objective is complete, General, she said, her voice low but resonant. But the mission is not over. Alex stood beside her, a silent, unshakable pillar of support. Operation Winter's Fury was not a failure. Katerina continued, her words precise and heavy as stone. It was a betrayal. We were led into a meticulously planned ambush, aided by someone within our own command structure. Javelin was the weapon they used, but he was not the hand that aimed it. We have a traitor general, and the cover-up has lasted for 5 years. Madsen's face, which had been basking in the glow of victory, hardened into a mask of cold fury and disbelief. Major, that is an accusation of treason. You'd better have more than a gut feeling. I have the proof in the archives, Alex cut in immediately, his voice sharp. Sanitized reports. A buried witness testimony from Colonel Thorne's wingman explicitly stating he heard the colonel yell, "They sold us out." The communications logs between the colonel and the major were deliberately erased. It's not a feeling, sir. It's a fact. The general sank back into his chair, the weight of their combined testimony pressing down on him. He was a man of structure, of loyalty, of the chain of command. The notion of such a profound betrayal from within was anathema to his entire worldview. He could crush this, bury it under his authority. but he looked at the two faces before him, Katerina the survivor who had carried this impossible burden for half a decade, and Alex, the son of his dearest friend, his eyes now clear with a terrible certainty. He saw the truth in them. His expression changed. The commander receded, replaced by a man of grim, unwavering duty. The betrayal was not just against the service. It was a personal stain on the memory of Marcus Thorne. "This room is sealed." He ordered, his voice a low growl. He activated a secure communications line on his desk, bypassing local command channels entirely. "This goes to the Inspector General, to the Office of Special Investigations. The real one. There will be no more secrets. Not on my watch." The wheels of a justice long denied began to grind into motion. Later, as the evening sky turned a deep indigo, Alex and Katerina walked out of the command building. The celebratory energy on the base had faded, replaced by the calm, steady rhythm of the night shift. The air was cool and clean. The war for them was finally over. They stopped standing near the memorial garden, where the names of the fallen were etched in black granite. Marcus Thorne's name was there, and so were the names of Katerina's pilots. "He would have been proud of you today," Katerina said softly, her gaze on the list of names. "You chose the truth over your anger." Alex looked at her, at the quiet strength that had endured so much. "He was always proud of you, Major." He replied the words, finally feeling true. He invested his legacy in you. He chose well. The chasm between them had closed. There were no more ghosts, no more legends. Only two survivors standing together in the quiet dark, their long vigil finally at an end, ready to let the dead rest in peace. Several weeks passed. The official investigation into Operation Winter's Fury moved with the silent, inexorable force of a glacier, its progress happening in secure rooms and classified reports, far from the daily life of the airbase. A quiet rumor circulated that a high-ranking general at command headquarters had been suddenly and forcefully retired, his portrait removed from the Hall of Honor overnight. Justice, it seemed, was not always loud. The base settled into a new normal. The legend of Javelin's demise became a hangar story, told with a mixture of awe and reverence. And the legend of Major Katerina Volkov transformed. She was no longer the ghost of Winter's Fury, a bad omen whispered about in hushed tones. She was Nyx, the hunter, the woman who had returned from the dead to slay a monster. But for Katerina, the titles no longer mattered. For the first time in 5 years, she felt the oppressive weight of her promise begin to lift. She had been officially reinstated, no longer a hidden asset, but a pilot on the active roster. By choice, she had started meeting with Captain Rostova, the flight psychologist. Their sessions were not interrogations, but quiet conversations in a sunlit room. They spoke not of tactics or trauma, but of the future. For the first time, Katerina was allowing herself to believe she might have one. Alex, too, was changed. The arrogant, hot-headed ace was gone, replaced by a quieter, more thoughtful leader. The anger that had fueled him for so long had burned away, leaving behind a core of tempered steel. His fellow pilots noticed the change. He was a better listener, a more patient teacher. In his briefings, he now spoke not just of angles and energy states, but of intuition, of listening to the sky, of understanding the pilot on the other side of the canopy. One cool, clear evening, he found Katerina standing near the end of the main runway, watching the last flight of F-16s return from their patrol. The setting sun painted the underbellies of the jets in hues of orange and rose. They stood in a comfortable silence for a moment, watching the planes land with practiced grace. "They're opening an inquiry into all of his old mission plans," Alex said quietly, breaking the silence. "The traitors." They think winter's fury might not have been the only time he sold us out. Katerina nodded slowly. A poison can spread deep if it's left untreated. Thank you, Alex said, turning to face her. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of 5 years of misunderstanding. For carrying that promise. For bringing him home to me. He was never gone, Alex, she replied, her gaze soft. He was with you in every choice you made. His legacy is safe now. It's yours to continue. The unspoken questions about their own futures hung in the air. Would she stay? Would she ever fly a combat mission again? Would he rise to command as his godfather had? None of it needed to be said. The path forward was no longer defined by the past. A ground crewman in a passing vehicle recognized them and honked the horn, giving a thumbs up. Alex raised a hand in acknowledgement. Katerina offered a small, genuine smile. The ice had not just been broken, it had melted away completely. Later that night, long after the last engine had fallen silent, Katerina found herself drawn back to the flight line one last time. The moon was a silver sliver in a sky awash with stars. The air was cold and still. She walked out onto the empty tarmac, the vast, silent expanse of the runway stretching out before her. For so long, the sky had been a place of ghosts. It was where she had lost her squadron, where she had fallen, where Marcus Thorne had made his final sacrifice. It had been a hunting ground, a place of vengeance and survival. It had been her prison. A flight of transport planes, their navigation lights blinking in a slow, steady rhythm, began their descent from the east. She stood and watched them, her head tilted back. She looked up at the infinite dark canopy above, and for the first time, she saw it with new eyes. There were no phantoms in the constellations, no echoes of gunfire in the whistling wind. The ghosts were finally quiet. The sky was not a battlefield. It was not a tomb. It was simply the sky, vast, silent, and full of a profound and tranquil peace. The weight was gone. The promise was fulfilled. The hunt was over. She was no longer running, no longer hiding, no longer fighting. A quiet sense of purpose settled over her, a feeling not of ownership or conquest, but of kinship with the vast emptiness above. She wasn't its victim or its master. She was its guardian, and she was finally home.